My coming to New York had been a mistake, for whereas I had looked for poignant wonder and inspiration in the teeming labyrinths of ancient streets that twist endlessly from forgotten courts and squares and waterfronts to courts and squares and waterfronts equally forgotten, and in the cyclopean modern towers and pinnacles that rise blackly Babylonian under waning moons, I had found instead only a sense of horror and oppression which threatened to master, paralyze, and annihilate me. A quote from H.P. Lovecraft's short story, He. The hidden creature in the dank corners of the basement, the escaped lunatic standing and staring through the window on a cold night, the dreadful chill down our spines when hearing a ghostly voice call out your name in an empty house. What is it that fascinates us so much about stories that terrify and horrify us? Like a rush of adrenaline, the feeling of living on the edge. Horror is defined as an intense feeling of fear, shock, and disgust. The origin of the word horror is derived from Latin, meaning to tremble, shudder, or to bristle, shake, or be terrified. In horror fiction, the use of the word horror is often distinguished from the use of the word terror, although terror and horror go hand in hand. Terror is described as the feeling of dread, whereas horror is described as the feeling of revulsion, typically following a frightening sight, sound, or other experience. The Gothic writer Anne Radcliffe says of terror, "It expands the soul and awakens the facilities to a high degree of life." Horror, in contrast, freezes and nearly annihilates them with its unambiguous displays of atrocity. Horror fiction gives the feeling of terror and horror. Often the central menace of a work of horror fiction can be interpreted as a metaphor for the larger fears of society. Horror has its roots in folklore and religious traditions focusing on death, the afterlife, evil, the demonic, and the principle of the thing embodied in a person. These aspects were manifested in stories of unknown creatures, of vampires, werewolves, ghostly apparitions, and of things hiding in the shadows. These terrors are often inspired by real-life evil. Bram Stoker's Dracula was inspired by Vlad Dracula III, also known as Vlad the Impaler, who was a military commander or prince of Wallachia in Romania, who was believed to have administered the most twisted means of torture on his enemies, impaling thousands of people, even women and children. Whether or not some of these stories are entirely true is debatable, but his cruelty has continued to live on in infamy. Countess Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian noblewoman, has been the inspiration for female vampires, as she was known as the most prolific female murderer, torturing and killing hundreds of young maidens for sadistic pleasure. And there were also some accusations of cannibalism. In folklore, tales of her drinking the blood of young maidens and bathing in their blood in order to maintain her youth were told, although those claims most likely have been inaccurate or simply embellishments. Nevertheless, evil committed by humans throughout the ages have inspired tales of horror and continue to do so until this day. Elizabeth Barrett said this about the nature of horror in her essay Elements of Aversion, quote, "The old fight-or-flight reaction of our evolutionary heritage once played a major role in the life of every human. Our ancestors lived and died by it. Then someone invented the fascinating game of civilization, and things began to calm down. development pushed wilderness back from the settled lands. War, crimes, and other forms of social violence came with civilization, and humans started preying on each other. But by and large, daily life calmed down. We began to feel restless, to feel something missing. The excitement of living on the edge, the tension between hunter and hunted. So we told each other stories through the long dark nights. When the fires burned low, we did our best to scare the daylights out of each other. The rush of adrenaline feels good. Our hearts pound, our breath quickens, and we imagine ourselves on the edge. Yet we also appreciate the insightful aspects of horror. Sometimes a story intends to shock and disgust, but the best horror intends to rattle our cages and shake us out of our complacency. It makes us think, forces us to confront ideas we might rather ignore, and challenge preconceptions of all kinds. Horror reminds us that the world is not always as safe as it seems, which exercises our mental muscles and reminds us to keep a little healthy caution close at hand." End quote. In horror stories, we are thrown into a world of chilling nightmares that push the boundaries of our imagination, and when we emerge from the darkness, we have the sensation that we have survived something life-threatening, and in many cases, we learn a little something about the nature of evil and about ourselves as well. The classic horror stories often seek to answer the question, what if? And place characters in scenarios that challenge our morality as well as our mortality. In Mary Shelley's novel, Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, Victor Frankenstein, an ambitious scientist, becomes fascinated with the idea of creating life in inanimate matter. He is able to resurrect the body of a pieced-together corpse of a man. His creation is so hideous to Victor, he shuns it, and the creature begins to take revenge on Victor's life. Victor Frankenstein played God, and although his intention was to create something beautiful, he soon realized that the creature's appearance was repulsive, with watery white eyes and thin yellow skin that barely covered the muscles and veins underneath. Just as the creature spoke to Victor, saying, "I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel." In stories like Frankenstein, man attempts to control the outcome of our fate, only to realize that things don't always work the way we had hoped. Victor Frankenstein comes to the grisly reality of what he has created, and when he is commanded by the creature to create a bride in the same manner, he is further taking on the role of God, and indeed he is referred to by the creature as his father. Much like in the Holy Bible, God created Eve as a companion to Adam. The creature Victor created longs to have companionship so that he might not be lonely in a world that is repulsed by him. But in the fear of the consequences of doing so, Victor is unable to fulfill that wish, and in the end, Victor's hope for a happy life is taken from him. His life is instead spent attempting to undo the damage he has done. In the novel The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells, a scientist named Griffin is able to make himself invisible and realizes he is able to commit crimes without being caught. In his struggle to live as an invisible man and for the crimes he commits, he is declared to be a menace to society and is hunted by police and townfolk. The Invisible Man later plans to terrorize the community in what he calls a reign of terror. He intends to seek a way to reverse his invisibility, but becomes too immersed in his newfound power, and in a game of cat and mouse with the authorities, he becomes hunted as a murderer and a madman. In the beginning of the story, Griffin goes about his day in disguise, looking for a cure for his invisibility. As advantageous as invisibility is, It is also very difficult to navigate and keep his invisibility secret for a long period of time. But as the story unfolds, he grows more angry and sinister to the point of madness. He no longer wishes to cure himself, but to exploit his godlike power and to take out his aggression against everyone else around him. This path only leads him to ruin. Having been discovered and hated by the townspeople, he becomes hunted like a dog. It is a tragic tale that shows that even our greatest dreams and desires can become nightmares. Another tale involving a mad scientist is the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. A mysterious and vile man known as Mr. Hyde is encountered by several people in town, and it is revealed that he is the heir to Dr. Jekyll's will. The townspeople are repulsed by Mr. Hyde's appearance and behavior, and soon several vicious crimes are committed, making the people suspect Mr. Hyde is involved. Dr. Jekyll is a reputable man of science, which leaves the people questioning the relationship between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, fearing that Mr. Hyde is perhaps forcing Dr. Jekyll to make him the sole proprietor of his will. But it is revealed that Dr. Jekyll, in a science experiment, has created a formula that brings out the darkest side of his human nature. The evil that is deep within him is made manifest by the repugnant Mr. Hyde. In the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, buried inside the subconscious of the mind is the darker, villainous side of our psyche, the side of us that is suppressed, and it becomes unleashed like a split personality. In horror stories, we are forced to come face to face with our fears. Some of the threads that run through many horror stories are things such as the fear of losing our sanity. Psychological horrors are explored in such films as The Silence of the Lambs, directed by Jonathan Demme, based on the novel by Thomas Harris. A young, ambitious FBI agent, Clarice Starling, must interview a brilliant yet deeply disturbed Hannibal the Cannibal Lecter in order to help solve the case of a girl kidnapped by the serial killer known only as Buffalo Bill. Hannibal Lecter is on the surface an intelligent and refined gentleman, but under the surface is an evil, methodic, murdering psychopath, and Clarice is forced to look into her own deep-seated childhood fears. In The Silence of the Lambs, the evil, the monster, is on the outside, lurking out in the darkness, like Buffalo Bill, or the evil is behind glass under lock and key, keeping it away from us, like Hannibal Lecter. But what happens when we are locked inside the cage with the monster? In the film The Shining, directed by Stanley Kubrick, based on a novel by Stephen King, Wendy and Danny Torrance are snowed in and trapped inside the Overlook Hotel, while husband and father Jack Torrance gradually slips into homicidal madness. Unable to escape, they are locked in with Jack as the evil of the hotel drives him to the brink of insanity, until his desire is to murder his wife and son. During the planning of the production of the film, the filmmakers constructed the interiors of the hotel in a sort of maze, giving it a confused floor plan where the layout seems to go on, and nothing made much sense. Much like the hedge labyrinth outside the hotel, the interior of the hotel was designed to give the feeling of being lost inside of a maze. This also alludes to the idea that essentially Wendy and Danny are trapped inside the labyrinth with the Minotaur. Another trick Kubrick and his crew would do was to move furniture and things in the background in between cuts, to create the feeling that things were not quite right in several scenes, almost as if the ghosts of the hotel were moving things around when we weren't looking. Techniques such as these were effective in giving the story an atmosphere of uneasiness, dread, and isolation from safety. This is made all the worse knowing that the person wielding the axe is not a stranger, but one of our own. A somewhat similar situation of being trapped inside the cage with the monster is another Stephen King story, Misery. Romance novelist Paul Sheldon is trapped inside the home of his #1 fan, Annie Wilkes, after his legs are severely damaged during an auto accident. Annie, who is a former nurse, appears to be a normal person at first, but begins to display her overly zealous fanaticism, and before long she keeps Paul Sheldon against his will, ordering him to write her a novel to stay alive, even going as far as to cripple him further to prolong his recovery. Obsession is taken to the limit and beyond. What happens when it becomes hard to separate the pages of a novel from reality? John Carpenter's film In the Mouth of Madness is heavily inspired by the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, who wrote strange and bizarre horror that has come to be called cosmic horror, where ancient gods and mythological creatures of old exist in a dark realm on the twisted edges of madness, where they are worshipped by cults and entire towns are partakers of strange mannerisms and rituals. In the Mouth of Madness is the story of a man named Trent, who is hired by Arcane Publishing to investigate the disappearance of horror writer Sutter Kane, whose books have been known to drive people mad. Arcane Publishing is also concerned with recovering the manuscript of Kane's final novel. During the investigation, Trent finds himself inside the world of Sutter Kane's novels, with people and places directly from the pages of his books. Trent's world is turned upside down as nothing is quite what it seems in a town of Sutter Kane's imagination, Hobbs End. The works of H.P. Lovecraft is also partly the inspiration for the world of the Macroverse, which is depicted in Stephen King's novel It. Lovecraft's stories evoke an atmosphere of paranoia and mentally disturbing terror, as well as what is being coined as body horror, where the characters undergo horrific changes to their bodily forms. It creates the uneasy fear of losing all control of ourselves. Another film from John Carpenter that draws from this type of horror is the 1982 film The Thing. In it, special effects makeup artist Rob Bottin created grotesquely deformed people after they've been taken over by the alien menace. The Thing is another film that effectively uses an isolated location and uncertainty of who is infected to create a deep sense of paranoia and fear. What makes these stories intriguing is we are placed into a claustrophobic environment where we are no longer in control. The evil cannot be seen outright and is hidden in the people closest to us, and we don't know who to trust anymore. In some cases, we can't even trust our own sanity, making us wonder what is real. In some horror stories, we find that evil is pulling the strings and conspiring to manipulate and control the minds of the world around us. One example of that is of the film They Live, written and directed by John Carpenter. They Live stars Roddy Piper and Keith David. The story is about a man who discovers a special pair of sunglasses which enable him to see that all around him are hideous aliens disguised as people, and the ruling class of society use subliminal messaging through advertisements and the media to keep people's minds asleep, to keep them spending money, breeding, and accepting the status quo. It's a vast conspiracy where society is being monitored and controlled like cattle, and there is no telling who you can trust. The film is a social commentary on commercialism and capitalism. They Live remains relevant even more now today than ever, where the mainstream media is even more deceptive and manipulative than ever before. Drones spying on the public, just as in the film. Advertisements are plastered all around us in billboards, the TV, and websites we visit every day, guided by our searches online. All engineered to keep us consumers buying into a fantasy world of self-centeredness. The mainstream media is so politically and financially motivated that it has the power to control the way people think. Google has even admitted to using our private data for constructing the perfect artificial intelligence program, all the while convincing us that they have our best interest in mind. Sometimes real life is more horrifying than fiction. In some cases, the threat comes from the people living next door to you. Films like Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, with Norman Bates and his controlling mother, demonstrate that the seemingly normal people we meet may not always be what they appear to be. They may just be completely and utterly deranged. Films like Psycho have traumatized its audience to the point where you can't help but be reminded of the film when you step into the shower or check into a motel. Case in point, in 1974, a film was released that taught us not to pick up hitchhikers on lonely roads, or not to go wandering into the wrong people's house. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was directed by Tobe Hooper and was primarily filmed near Round Rock, Texas. The story of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre deals mainly with Sally Hardesty, her invalid brother Franklin, and her friends who are on a trip through rural Texas after the news is sent out that several cemetery plots have been vandalized and the bodies of loved ones have been dug up and stolen. Sally and her brother go to check on her family's plots and visit their old home. During their travel in a Volkswagen van, they pick up a strange hitchhiker who works at the local slaughterhouse. The hitchhiker's behavior alarms the passengers of the van, and he ultimately brandishes a straight razor and attacks Franklin, cutting his arm. They kick him out of the van, leaving him walking. After visiting the abandoned family home, the friends wander off into a neighboring home in hopes to borrow some gasoline. That turns out to be the dwelling place of a family of mentally disturbed cannibals. One of the members in particular is a large, mentally deranged man who wears a mask made from a human face and wields a chainsaw, Leatherface. Soon, Sally Hardesty is catapulted into a world of torture and madness. The film's climax iconically shows Leatherface swinging his chainsaw like a ballet dancer from hell, and Sally, having lost her grip on reality, laughing maniacally while barely making her escape. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the person of Leatherface was inspired by real-life serial killer Ed Gein. The story of Ed Gein also inspired the story The Silence of the Lambs, and bears resemblance to Robert Bloch's novel Psycho. Although in the case of Psycho, Robert Bloch had written the majority of the novel before having knowledge of Ed Gein's gruesome crimes. But in an odd coincidence, the similarities between Norman Bates and Ed Gein were uncanny. The film Halloween, directed by John Carpenter, was in turn inspired by Hitchcock's Psycho. In the world of horror, terror comes in all forms, in all shapes and sizes. One thing we know for certain, in a horror story, no place is safe. Whether in our neighborhoods, or in our homes, or even the threat can come from the most unlikely places. Little furry aliens with huge mouths, filled with razor-sharp teeth, terrorized a small town in the film Critters. In Joe Dante's Gremlins, hundreds of mischievous little creatures run amok in the town of Kingston Falls during the Christmas season. Malicious animated puppets terrorize in The Puppet Master. Little devilish creatures are summoned in the film Ghoulies, as well as in the film The Gate. And evil little sprites are conjured up in an apartment complex in the movie Troll. Short monsters of horror also include Chucky from the Child's Play series and the Leprechaun, proving that there is no height requirement for terror. Oftentimes, the horror stories center around the supernatural, where the boundaries of reality and the spiritual are shattered, and the protagonist must face an inhuman evil with extraordinary power. Angry ghosts torment a family in their new home when it is revealed that the house was built above an old cemetery in the classic supernatural thriller Poltergeist. Nowhere are the consequences pushed to the limit than stories where the supernatural and otherworldly horrors are unleashed. In the novel Pet Sematary by Stephen King, doctor and husband Louis Creed attempts to defy death when his young son is killed, and he buries the body in an ancient Indian burial ground where the dead come back to life. But he soon finds that sometimes dead is better. When the people that come back from the dead are possessed by an evil spirit of the woods, the Wendigo, they come back, but they are not the same. The story of Pet Sematary deals with the loss of loved ones and coming to terms with death. Lewis's wife, Rachel, and his daughter Ellie are not ready to accept death as a part of life. When Ellie's cat is run over by a diesel truck, Lewis attempts to prolong as much as he can his daughter having to face the reality of death. And although Ellie's cat Church comes back evil, Lewis believes that he can somehow outsmart the evil that lives in the cemetery when he buries his child there. But unfortunately, his son Gage returns as evil as the ground he was buried in. When it comes to the most terrifying and disturbing supernatural horror tales, there is one film that continues to chill us to the bone. The Exorcist, directed by William Friedkin, based on the novel by William Peter Blatty, was released in 1973. The story centers around a young girl who becomes demon-possessed and acts out in disturbingly evil ways. Her mother requires the help of two Catholic exorcists who must challenge and drive out the evil entity within her. The demon scarifies her face and body, and causing it to contort in inhuman ways, as well as causing objects to float and be tossed about the room. As the story continues, the young girl held captive by this unholy evil begins speaking different languages and disgustingly spews vomit from her mouth. During the ordeal, the young priest assisting during the exorcist is taunted and tormented to the breaking point of his own guilt and fears. When The Exorcist was shown in theaters, there were many reports of people fainting in the theater, claims of people even having heart attacks and being traumatized by the horror that they witnessed. People threw up in the theater restrooms, and psychologists reported many cases of what is called cinematic neurosis by people following viewings of the film. So what is it that fascinates us so much about these dark and disturbing tales? What causes us to take a peek over the edge of fear and insanity to catch a glimpse of darkness and death? Through stories that grab us and show us our worst fears, our most haunting nightmares, we discover something about ourselves. The thrill of a dangerous event can heighten our senses, can make us react as if our lives depended on it, and in most cases it does. In the stillness of the night, when all is quiet and calm, when a strange noise is heard outside your window or in the basement, or perhaps it's only in your head. The hairs on the back of your head stand up, and a chill runs down your spine. Suddenly your eyes widen, your ears perk up. Suddenly you are no longer in control. The fear overtakes you. There is something to be said about being the cause of the fear. Like telling ghost stories around the bonfire outside at night with your friends. The sensation you feel when you scare your friends. It's like a feeling of power, of being in control. But when a sudden rustling sound is heard from the darkness, we soon realize we are no longer in control. Many times horror stories force us to face our greatest fears, and if we are strong, we can overcome them. They cause us to either run for our lives or to face the evil head on. When we walk through that dark night, it gives us a much greater appreciation for the daylight. It can also make us realize that as great a power as evil can be, that greater is the power of good. The best horror makes us think about morality and the human condition, as well as look towards the spiritual aspects of existence. When we stare into the true face of evil, we are able to see how disturbingly horrifying it really is, and we are repulsed by it, because in reality, we would never in our right minds wish to live in that place. This is why psychological horror stories can be very powerful, because when we are fighting an outside evil, it can feel as though defeating it is possible. But when the evil slips inside of us, possesses us, or our minds, and threatens the fabric of our rational thought, that can be the most terrifying terror. It is then that we sometimes look towards that which is a symbol of what is pure and good. The crucifix is a symbol of good in many horror stories. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, it is the cross, or the crucifix, or the communion wafers that hold the evil vampire at bay. Crosses have been used against the power of darkness in horror stories, being prevalent especially in stories of vampires. In the 1985 film Fright Night, Charlie Brewster's neighbor Jerry Dandridge is revealed to be a vampire. He recoils at the sight of the crucifix, but as he declares in the movie, "You have to have faith for that to work on me, Mr. Vincent." In A Nightmare on Elm Street, a children's nursery rhyme reminds us to grab your crucifix to protect your dreams from Freddy Krueger. The crucifix, being a symbol of the power of good, is used to ward off the forces of darkness. When the protagonist of a horror story overcomes the evil and evil is punished, often we can feel a sense of confidence in maintaining control when life is out of balance, restoring the balance, and the realization that ultimately evil cannot control us. Nancy turns her back on Freddy Krueger, telling him that he has no power over her anymore, which causes him to be destroyed. For a time, at least, until the sequel. Because let's face it, these days, you gotta have the sequel. There is no doubt that horror has become increasingly more violent over the decades, as the audiences become more desensitized, causing creators to up the gruesome imagery in order to shock and terrify. As with any form of storytelling, as nearly every scary situation has been used, it seems that storytellers rely on shocking the audience in more inventive ways. In film, special effects became more advanced, giving rise to much more visceral and realistic violent images than ever before. Although the artistry of prosthetic makeup and creature effects have become more advanced, in most cases it is better to have a compelling story and performances than to simply shock and disgust. Jump scares are effective, but when a film relies too heavily on jump scares and neglects to create a convincing atmosphere of terror, the impact of the film suffers. The same goes for a heavy reliance on computer-generated effects compared to practical effects. The best illusions are created by mixing the two methods in clever ways that emphasize the advantage of each medium and minimizes the disadvantages. A lot of what helps to create the illusion and atmosphere is the use of sound effects and music, combined with good film editing. The violence on screen is sometimes implied by sound effects, music, and convincing performances by the actors, and it leaves it to the audience's imagination to fill in the blanks. When the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was released, it struggled to get an R rating, even though Tobe Hooper originally hoped for a PG rating, and it was actually banned in the UK for many years until it was granted a license by the Camden London Borough Council in 1998. Many people were disgusted and traumatized by the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, stating that the film was simply too violent. The irony is, the film has hardly any blood shown throughout. There are a few scenes where blood is shown, but not nearly as much as everyone remembers, because most of the violence is actually implied and never seen. But the scary images and macabre violence are heavily implied, making it seem more disturbing than what is actually shown. It shows how effective having less can be more, when an atmosphere of uneasiness and madness are created. As horrific fictional tales can be, it pales in comparison to the horrors of real life and the atrocities committed by human beings. In some aspects, art is not responsible for the violence men do to each other, but because art can have such a profound effect on culture, it leaves it up to the artist to recognize or not just how much influence they have and what responsibility they owe to the public. So the question is, just because you can do it, should you do it? This is a question posed to society as a whole and not exclusively to artists and writers. Just because you have the freedom to express yourself in the most vile ways imaginable, should you set limits for yourself? Some would rather not, and some feel they have a responsibility and an obligation to regulate how they express themselves, being aware of what kind of impact you might have on others. The responsibility ultimately lies on the individual. Freedom, like anything good, can be abused. An interesting take on the subject was presented in the film Scream by Wes Craven. When a horror fanatic goes on a killing spree, using horror films as a means to torment their victims, the killer said, "Don't blame the movies. Movies don't create psychos. Movies make psychos more creative." Stories that delve into the darker side of life can often illustrate hidden fears we might deal with, and those fears are expressed in creative ways. The fear of losing control of our lives, the fear of revealing to others our weaknesses, the fear of what lurks in the darkness, or what lurks inside of ourselves. Some aspects of horror can take on a metaphorical or symbolic meaning or interpretation. It all depends on what it means to the audience and their imagination. For example, 1956's Invasion of the Body Snatchers is considered by critics to be an allegory for McCarthyism and the fear of the spread of communism. In the horror film The Babadook, the strange entity known as the Babadook can be seen as a metaphor for depression and grieving. In the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the story explores the struggle of good versus evil, in particular repression of the evil side of our psyche, our sinful nature hidden within. It is also a metaphor for the dark side of modern science and progression at odds with the metaphysical spirituality of human beings. Horror is, like other forms of fiction, an outlet for the imagination, an exploration of the realms of our mind that handle subjects and situations that can be traumatic, dreadful, and terrifying. The parts of life that shock us into action. Clive Barker, author of The Hellbound Heart and director of the 1987 film Hellraiser, said this: "I want to be remembered as an imaginer, someone who used his imagination as a way to journey beyond the limits of self, beyond the limits of flesh and blood, beyond the limits of even perhaps life itself, in order to discover some sense of order in what appears to be a disordered universe. I'm using my imagination to find meaning, both for myself and I hope for my readers." In horror, we experience our greatest fears through the eyes of the characters in the story, knowing no matter where the characters end up by the end, we ourselves remain unharmed. It can be a way to cope with serious trauma, but if not careful, horror fiction can trigger or provoke traumatic events in the reader or viewer. This is also why horror is really not intended for children, because there are some things that children are not mentally or emotionally prepared to see. There are some things that may even be unhealthy for adults to see. What is good for one individual may not be good for all. It is the equivalent of going to ride on a roller coaster, and there are precautions that must be taken into consideration. But there are no doubt plenty of thrill seekers who live for this stuff. Every year, Texas Frightmare Weekend takes place, and thousands of people come to celebrate their love of horror, where vendors sell horror-themed merchandise. Famous celebrities and filmmakers of the horror industry gather in one place to meet and greet, and even party with their fans. Fans dress up in their favorite characters from the screen. They have film showings, karaoke night, and so forth. The community of horror fans who attend the Texas Frightmare Weekend have such a love and appreciation of the genre, and it shows by their enthusiasm and creativity, such as with the imaginative costumes they make and the variety of handmade items that are sold by the vendors. One thing is certain. The genre of horror has amassed an extremely large fan base who share a common love for all things terrifying. So as you venture out this Halloween season, be safe. Be aware of the dangers that lurk in the darkness, and know that no matter what evil is present, that the only power it has is what you allow it. And before you prepare to crawl into bed at night, as you turn on the nightlight, check inside the closet and look under the bed. Don't forget to say your prayers, and remember to tell yourself it's not real. It's only a story. It's only a story.